Welcome to the Carter Center. I'm Mary Ann Peters, the CEO here, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this first Conversations at the Carter Center of the 2018-2019 season. This series gives us an opportunity to discuss Carter Center peace and health efforts, as well as some of the most pressing issues facing the world. Tonight's conversation is an annual favorite, giving you in the audience and everyone around the globe watching our live stream the chance to hear from a former president and first lady. And not just any former president and first lady, but Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. Now, those who've been here before know this, but if you have a question for one of them, please write it on the index cards we've provided. Volunteers will walk down the aisles to collect those cards at about 7:20. Before I turn things over to President and Mrs. Carter, let me put in a brief plug for our next conversation, which will be held on October 18th. We'll be discussing trachoma, a leading cause of preventable blindness. For 20 years, the Carter Center has helped to lead the charge against this disease, but we're not alone in the fight. Some of our partners are actually right here in Atlanta, and the city is playing an ever-expanding role in the battle to improve global health. You can reserve a seat for this event starting next week by visiting our website, cartercenter.org. And I also want to take a moment to offer a special welcome to the Rosalynn Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellows in attendance, as well as Ambassador Circle guests and any Board of Trustee or Board of Counselor members. I'd like all of you to please stand. Yay. Thank you. We're glad you can be here with us this evening. Finally, let me remind you to silence your cell phones. However, feel free to tweet about what you hear using the hashtag Carter Center Town Hall 18, all the nouns in caps. And now the reason we're all here. President and Mrs. Carter founded the Carter Center 36 years ago, and since then the center's programs have helped to improve people's lives in more than 80 countries. The center's staff of more than 1,400 people, 200 here and the rest around the world, wage peace, fight disease, and build hope, both by engaging with officials at the highest levels of government and by working side by side, hand in hand, with poor and often forgotten or neglected people. No one has worked harder to make the center's goals a reality than President and Mrs. Carter. They've traveled the world with us, monitoring elections and resolving conflicts, promoting human rights, and helping to eradicate diseases in developing nations. What we've learned from President and Mrs. Carter, their vision of a healthy, peaceful world guides our work at the Carter Center and serves as an inspiration for millions around the world. Please join me again in welcoming President and Mrs. Carter.
Thank you, Marianne. Well, I think we have a mixed crowd today. Some of you have heard a lot about the Carter Center recently, and some of you haven't. But I'm gonna kind of thread the needle and talk to both sides simultaneously, but probably you'll hear some things that you don't want to hear, and you might don't hear some things that you want to hear. So anyway, I'm going to outline briefly what the Carter Center is doing now, and on occasion I'll describe what we've been doing in the past. The Carter Center has began our effort just believing that we would be a place like Camp David, where folks with an altercation between them or a potential war or an actual conflict going on could come and we would negotiate peace agreements. And we still work on peace. Another thing that we did was to find out very soon that when two generals, say, in our country are having a civil war, the people under them want to have peace. And the generals don't want to talk to each other. So sometimes they would not even let me go back and forth between the two commanders and negotiate a peace agreement. So we decided finally, about 30 years ago, why don't we go to both generals? As you know, there's one truism in politics, and that is self-delusion. Everybody who runs for office is self-deluded. They all think they're going to win, right? Well, we would go to both generals and say, why don't you let the Carter Center come in to your country and hold an honest and fair election and make sure that the will of the people is expressed, and we're sure that the right person will win. So they would say, okay. So we began about 30 years ago holding elections around the world and monitoring them. And we just finished our 107th elections recently. And the ones that we've had this year are Liberia. Liberia had a very good election. A woman was president of Liberia, the first woman elected in Africa. And her term ran out. And they had the first transfer of authority from her to her successor in the history of Liberia. And so this was 70 years ago they had the last peaceful transfer of power. So that's what we did in Liberia. In Nepal, that's where Mount Everest is, if you don't know, they had a monarchy until about 8 or 10 years ago. And the monarchy was the only one in the world that was based strictly on religion. And so they did away with them in a revolution, and in this past election we helped with that. And Nepal had their first election for legislators since they had a monarchy. So that's what we do. We always go to troubled elections, and we finished 107 of them. Some of them worked out quite well. Some of them, Rose and I have had to leave at midnight just to escape with our lives when we condemned the election as fraudulent ahead of time. Well, those are two of the ones that we do. We also try to resolve serious problems in the country. And in the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, we have tried to promote human rights and try to orchestrate an honest election. That'll come later on this year, we hope. But one of the things that we are concerned about is the Congo has so many minerals in the ground, and so the Carter Center got involved in analyzing the mineral industry in the Republic of Congo. And we issued a report earlier this year, and it showed that the mining company that controls the mining in Nepal, basically for the government, there was $750 million missing, unaccounted for. So we published our report. They raised hell about it, but public pressure has been brought on Congo now, recently on the mining industry, and maybe we'll have some improvements in the future. Our human rights program is generic in effect. That is, everything we do here comes under human rights. And human rights is basically learning how to treat everybody as equals in the eyes of God and in the eyes of government. And that includes women and African Americans and immigrants and so forth. So the Carter Center works on human rights. We have found in our effort to make women's status known, the persecution against women, which we think is the worst in the world, improved. And I wrote a book about it 3 or 4 years ago, and we still work on that. We found that the Muslims, the Islam community, has been very receptive to our efforts. So we've been working a lot with the Islamic community in Africa particularly, and when they've gone to the Quran and looked at the right verses, which we're trying to do with the Christian Bible too, they find that the Quran calls for equality of treatment among women. So we're making very good progress within the Islamic community. We had a conference this year, which we do ordinarily, an assembly of human rights heroes, which we call defenders of human rights. We had about 36 countries represented, and I think we had 60 participants. And the subject was very well chosen for the United States as well, restoring faith in freedom. This is a very serious challenge around the world, is a lack of faith in democracy and freedom as the best kind of government. And we feel that that's a challenge not only in other countries but in our country as well. We deal with with the most serious problems in the world, sometimes in partnership with our own government, sometimes not. Syria, as you know, is about the worst war going on in our country, in the world now. The last 6 or 7 years, they've had terrible catastrophe in Syria. And the Carter Center started out there by mapping individual military organizations, some of them were very small organizations, so that we could know where the different people were located in Syria as the war changed its back and forth in the country. And so we have continued to do that. We have monitored, for instance, if you're interested in statistics, 130,000 combat events, 130,000 exchanges of gunfire in Syria. And sometimes that results in a movement of people, and we try to monitor where those people are located by taking cognizance of their transmissions by blog and by social media. And we're very effective in doing that. We share our information, the Carter Center does, with the U.S. government and with the United Nations. And when President Putin decided to help Syria, which has been very effective on their side, I sent President Putin a letter. I have his email address because we both like to fish for salmon in the same river in Russia, and Rose and I were fishing there a couple of years ago. But anyway, we formed a friendship there, so he gave me an email address. So I sent it to him. I said, we have this map of Syria, so you can tell every day where all of the military forces are located in the country. And the next day he responded and said, we would like very much to get that map too. So we've been sending our mapping information to Russia. So now we know that when he bombs the wrong place, it's his own mistake and not our mistake. And sometimes he bombs places that we don't want him to bomb. But anyway, that's what was going on. And the United States has still stayed involved, the Carter Center has, in the negotiations that are still taking place on what to do about Syria in the future. I wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times 2 or 3 weeks ago. It spelled out the Carter Center's basic position. And as you know, Russia and Iran and Turkey are the 3 outside countries that have the most to do about what's going to happen in Syria. And they're having meetings, and quite often when they have meetings, they invite the Carter Center to come, although they don't invite the U.S. government to come. You need not tell anybody I said that. But anyway, but we stay involved in what's going to happen in Syria and hope that we can have ceasefire first and then sort out the long-term elements of their government in the future. So in Mali is the first time they've ever called the United States and the United Nations and the governments, other governments involved, have called on a non-governmental organization to help them with a peace agreement. They had a peace agreement in Mali between 3 different entities, political entities and military entities, but it hasn't been enforced. So last year, the United Nations and other participants, all 3 of the parties involved, called on the Carter Center to help them implement the peace agreement that's already been negotiated, and we're working on that every day. In Nicaragua, as you know, there's still a very violent uprising against Daniel Ortega and his government. The Carter Center has helped to monitor 4 elections in Nicaragua over a period of years. And the first 3 elections that we monitored, the Sandinistas under Ortega lost. The last time we monitored an election, he won. And since that time, we have not been permitted to come back in to Nicaragua to negotiate, to monitor an election anymore. But they did have finally a kind of a dialogue or meeting with all the interested parties, and the Carter Center was permitted to go in and monitor that. So we're still involved in Nicaragua. We have a very important issue that involves women and on our general access to information program. We have it in a number of countries around the world where we have always promoted access to information, that is, to let the citizens of a country know what their government was doing, what they're spending the money for, and so forth. And we found out not to our surprise, but to our concern, that women don't have equal access to information even when men do. So we're trying to equate the two and make sure that women all over the world have equal access to information about what goes on in the government. Because quite often, women in an oppressed country don't even realize that they have a right to own property. If their husbands die, the children's uncles get it or something. And women don't even have a right to know that they can own their children if their husbands die first, things of that kind. So we teach women all we can, and also make them have access to their governments. We have long had a program in China ever since we normalized diplomatic relations with China. The first day of 1979, when I was in office, we normalized diplomatic relations with China. As you know, in recent years, the United States and China have gotten at odds. President Trump is trying to impose some very stringent punishment on China for economically, and hundreds of billions of dollars are involved. And yesterday it was put in the news this afternoon. I just watched it. China under Xi Jinping, president, and Russia under Putin had a meeting of their own to line up China and Russia against the United States to combat what we're doing to them economically. So we're still working with China every year to try to, I'd say, preserve the good relationships that we had with China when I was in the White House. And we've been cut out of a lot of the programs in China, but they have permitted us to try to work out peace programs inside the continent of Africa that involve both the United States and China. So we're working on that now. And we're having a meeting about this time in Djibouti, which is a little place on the northern coast of Africa. Well, let me cover very quickly our health programs. You've heard a lot about guinea worm. We feel that since we started our guinea worm program, we have prevented people having 80 million cases of guinea worm. And we're struggling with that we're still struggling with that very actively. Last year we had 30 cases of guinea worm. This year so far we have 11 cases. We might have 2 or 3 more cases this year. But we've been surprised by discovering, as you've heard before probably, that animals also have guinea worm. It hasn't been proven that animals transmit it into human beings, but in some countries, like in Mali, we have a lot of animals like dogs and cats and even monkeys and baboons that carry guinea worm disease. So we're struggling with that serious problem. River blindness is one of the 2 eyesight programs on which we work. The other one is trachoma. River blindness in 2 states in Nigeria, we have done away with river blindness to the extent that we no longer have to give any treatments to people to prevent river blindness. And we've adopted 7 more states now in Nigeria to work on that problem. In this hemisphere, we've eliminated guinea worm from 4 countries. We still have, not guinea worm, but river blindness in 4 countries, and we still have a small tribe of Yanomami people in the jungles, quite isolated part of the jungles between Venezuela and Brazil. And we are now trying to find out where those villages are and get to them. We've made some progress on it, but now we are resurrecting abandoned airstrips that used to provide access to those villages, and we hope that in the future we'll have a better report to make on that. Trachoma is the #1 cause of preventable blindness. We're working on trachoma primarily in Ethiopia, but in 7 nations in all. We have administered Zithromax, which is an antibiotic that prevents the spread of trachoma, 175 million doses of that, and each year we conduct, or supervise the conduct of tens of thousands of operations on people's eyes. In Hispaniola, which is nearby, that's Haiti and the Dominican Republic, it's the only place left in the Caribbean that has malaria and also lymphatic filariasis, which is the same as elephantiasis, is when your legs or arms or sexual organs swell up to grotesque sizes. And to summarize that, recently we analyzed 14,000 6 and 7-year-old children, and in Haiti, which is by far the worst country, in Haiti we didn't find a single case of malaria or lymphatic filariasis except in the capital city of Port-au-Prince. So that was a big achievement as well. So in the boondocks, you might say, of Haiti, we can't find any remaining lymphatic filariasis or malaria. That concludes my abbreviated remarks about what we're doing around the world. And now I'll turn the program over to Rosalynn, who has the most important part of the Carter Center, which you'll soon hear, and that is mental health. And as I've said many times, always I have a better evening with Rosalynn after I say it. If the Carter Center hadn't done anything except promote Rosalynn's mental health program, it would be all worthwhile. So, my bye.
And I told him I was going to have a lot to say about mental health tonight, so I think he thought he better get all of his in to begin with. But I do have, it's just a great day. We have mental health fellows, journalism fellows here with us. And I'm going to ask you to stand up again so people can see who you are. The fellows, mental health fellows, here they are. And they're not only from our country. We have fellows from Colombia, from the United Arab UAE, and from Qatar. And you can sit down now. I'm just really proud of them and had a great day listening to them. We have 2 sets. Last year's come in and tell us what they did over the past year about mental health. And the new ones come in and tell us what they're going to talk about. So today we listened to all of those 6 of them, I think 6, all of those who were last year's. And it's so exciting. In Colombia and UAE and Qatar, they are really changing the way mental health is thought about in those countries. I heard we listened to their, as I said, we listened to their presentations today, and it's just really exciting to see how, what an effect they're having on people's thoughts about mental illness in those countries. So it's been a good day, and we continue tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll hear from the new ones that have been named this year and what they're going to be doing over the next year. Well, I brought a lot of notes because I wanted to remember some of the things that I was afraid I would lose out. But this is a very important time in the mental health field for those of us who's worked in it for so long, because mental health is finally being recognized on the global level as a significant health and economic burden. Now that has never happened before. And the Carter Center has been involved in 3 events that show, my notes say, historic shift in the global mental health landscape. It's just so exciting what's happening there. For instance, we're participating in the launch of a new global mental health campaign in New York City during the United Nations General Assembly Week, which is later in September. And the campaign will advance mental health efforts across governments, funders, and all sectors. And in October, we are featured in 2 events. The first ever Global Mental Health Summit that's going to take place in London, and we'll be there. And then at that summit in London, there's a debut of the new Lancet Global Mental Health Series, which the Carter Center has been involved in, actually as an author of part of that series. So as global mental health gains momentum and attention from the United Nations, World Health Organization, and government leaders and funders, our Carter Center Mental Health Program has been right there in the middle of all of it. It's so exciting. It's just something that I've worked for so long, and to see it happening is just so exciting to me. And our mental health program is very much involved with Patrick Kennedy and the Kennedy Satcher Center for Mental Health Equity at Morehouse School of Medicine. And right now, and parity is 10 years old. The parity law is 10 years old in October, but it has not been implemented the way it should have been.
What is
And,
parity? What is parity?
Parity for parity coverage by insurance for mental health illnesses, just as it does for physical illnesses. And it's something we worked on for so long, and now 10 years has been passed and it hadn't been implemented properly. And I'm now in the process of writing an op-ed piece with Patrick Kennedy to talk about the need, to write about the need for implementing parity. And I just read in the paper this, in an article just a few days ago, that several states are developing their own parity standards. Colorado, Delaware, Tennessee, Illinois, and Rhode Island. So I think it seems like people are getting ready for some standards to go by to implement parity. It's exciting to me. And I think that the Washington Post is going to take our op-ed piece when we get it ready. And it will be in October. So I think that's just about all. I had a lot of notes, I thought. But it didn't take long for me to go through them. It is exciting, though, to have the fellows here. And it is exciting now that mental health is being recognized as it should be, I think, all over the world. Not some places, not as much as others, but it's going to be better, I think, for people with mental illnesses, and I'm excited about that. Thank you.
President and Mrs. Carter will take as many questions as we have time for tonight, and I want to thank those here in the room or those who submitted their questions online or via Twitter. It's not always obvious to me, these are handwritten by our communications staff, where the question comes from. But here's the first one for President Carter. President Carter, you seem to have a great sense of humor. Have you ever used humor to help diffuse a tense situation or to help come to a resolution? If so, examples, please. I didn't write it.
What's the next question?
Okay. As an immigrant, it's growing easier to be cynical about our country. How would you encourage immigrant youth to remain optimistic when America doesn't feel like the home they dreamed of?
Well, I think the basic cause of a need for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one thing, and that is equality. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is, there is no such difference as between Jews and Gentiles. There's no difference between men and women. There's no difference between anybody in the eyes of God. And I think that that is what the Universal Declaration of Independence tries to address, is the elimination of governments and society considering that one set of people or one kind of person is different from another. And I think that applies to immigrants as well. In fact, a basic foundation of the Jewish religion and Christian religion, as well as Islam and perhaps even Hindus and others, is that you always welcome a guest in your home, and that comes as a top priority. And so I think we should treat the immigrants the same as we treat everybody else. And there have been proposals made in the past to give newcomers who are not yet American citizens citizenship over a period of time if they don't have any crime committed, or if they've been held an adequate number of time and have a job. The restraints are very strong. So I would say that maybe after 2020, most of the people who are here in our country doing a hard job working, who might be not yet American citizens, will have a good hope for equal treatment. But I think it's going to take patience on the part of all of us in dealing with that, because under the present administration, immigrants have been made to feel like they're inferior, even if they are already American citizens, or if they were born here, or if they came here as infants with their parents. And the legal way for parents to become citizens is very uncertain at this time. So I would say, if you want to stay in our country, have faith in American principles and the goodwill of American people, and be patient.
Here's a question for Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter, why do you suppose the stigma for mental illness continues?
I wish I knew. It's something I've worked on for almost 48 years now. I think that I think it's changing, and I think it's not going to be too long before it's going to be okay. That's my hope. But I do believe it's changing, and I think the young people are going to be the ones that change it. I remember going to see my mother she was in an assisted living home because she couldn't walk, and I would go to see her, and one day she talked about a psychiatrist coming to see her when she was in the hospital, and she thought that was terrible. I said, "Mother, that's what I've been working on all these years." But in the place she was in, there is no way everybody in there could have had help of a mental health professional, but there was no way they were going to let a mental health professional come into that place. And so it's going to be the young people that change, and I think it's beginning, and I think it's going to be pretty rapid, that it's going to be okay. I think it's what people have learned in the past, like my mother, that we called it a nervous breakdown, I think, something like that. And it was just that they saw the problems, but they saw no solutions to them. And so it just continued to be carried from one generation to another. But I think it's going to be pretty fast now that the stigma disappears.
This question comes from Elizabeth Link, 10 years old, on behalf of Mrs. Ciray's 5th grade class at the museum school. The question is for President Carter. If you were still president, what would you do about climate change?
Well, to summarize, I would do everything that California is already doing. The things that we did then was to conserve energy and to prevent the waste of energy, and that's where the origin of carbon dioxide comes from, is the unnecessary burning of fossil fuels. So we did everything we could to eliminate the excessive entry of carbon dioxide into the air. And I think that we also tried in the oil drilling area to eliminate the distribution of methane, because a lot of people then were just burning the methane that came out of wells, and we tried to eliminate that. The Trump administration has just issued a new set of guidelines that became publicized today to ease the restraint on oil and gas companies on the emission of methane into the air. Methane is not as plentiful as as carbon dioxide, but it's a lot more capable of causing global warming. And so those are two things I would do. But I think that California under Jerry Brown, who ran against me for president, by the way, unsuccessfully, I might add, I think he's just really an enlightened governor. And if you want to see the right things to do about global warming, I would say look at what California is doing or attempting to do on automobile efficiency and on the end of unnecessary distribution of those gases into the air.
If he'd been elected another term, if he'd been elected for another term, we wouldn't need to be looking at that now. We would already have the laws in place to combat it.
Today, as we all know, is September 11th, and I have two questions related to September 11th for President and Mrs. Carter. The first is simply, where were you on 9/11? And the second is a little more complicated. Looking back on this landmark day in American history, where do you think we stand on safety, both domestically and internationally, since 9/11/2001?
Well, Rose and I were on the way from Plains, Georgia, up to the Carter Center when we heard on the radio through the Secret Service that who were driving the car that was an apparent attack on the Twin Towers in New York. And at first, the Secret Service informed us that they thought it was just a small plane that had run into the towers by mistake. So the closer we got to Atlanta, the more we realized that it was a concerted attack. And by the time we got here and turned on the television and watched, the towers were collapsing, and they had already had an attack on the Pentagon, and the airplane went down, as you know, in the field in Pennsylvania. So that's where we were and what we were doing, and we finished out our work week at the Carter Center after 9/11. As far as right now, I would say that the United States has aroused the protective spirit of American people that may have dissipated by now, but we have caused all the local law enforcement officials and state officials and federal officials to work more closely together on rooting out any threats, and we have prevented a lot of attacks on our country by terrorists of different kinds, some acting alone and some acting from instructions overseas. I think in the long term, though, we have moved backwards in a way of removing some of the human rights that we used to adhere to. So I think we need to strike a good balance between protecting ourselves and giving American people complete freedom to communicate without it being disclosed to the government and things of that kind. And we have abandoned, as you know, some of the principles of, like the Geneva Convention under President Bush, and part of those have been restored. So in our human rights program, we deplore the attacks on Americans' freedom and human rights, but we encourage law enforcement officials to be more vigilant. And I would say that we are more safe now than we were, obviously, back in 9/11. The Carter Center has a very impressive program that I didn't cover earlier in order to save time, and that is that we analyze ISIS or other names, Daesh, that recruit people in overseas. And the Carter Center analyzes the techniques that the ISIS uses to recruit young people to go over there and fight. And we do that in a number of countries, in France, for instance, and in Morocco, and in the United States, and in one or two other countries. And that's a very effective program. We're trying to do it without arousing animosity against Muslims. And so we draw a fine balance there. So I would say that our country is probably more safe than it was in 9/11.
That was the day of the first meeting of the Mental Health Journalism Fellows. And as Jimmy said, we were on the way here. And we had some from New Zealand. And we got here to the Carter Center, and the ones from New Zealand were here. And none of the ones from our country came that day, of course. Everybody was there. But we didn't have any kind of meeting. We just sat around and looked at TV all day. But it's kind of interesting that that was the beginning of the Mental Health Fellows program.
I've been trying to think of some time when I use humor. I took a kind of an oath before, when I first started the Carter Center, that I would never fail to answer a question, and I hate to let that one go. But one time I remember in Nicaragua, the first time we did the election down there, the Sandinistas were in power, and they had an election, and they thought they were going to win. And the opponents, Mrs. Chamorro, during the night, it became obvious to me and to other observers that the Sandinistas was going to lose by 12 to 15 points. So I went and met with the Sandinistas. There were nine of them, and I sat in front of them and looking at the whole crowd of Sandinista leaders, and I said, you know, there's life after defeat, and you all can have a better life. And they said, well, how do you mean? What do you mean, President Carter? And I said, well, what happened to me in my last election? And they said, you lost. And I said, well, do you think I have failed in life since then? They said, well, if you had failed, you wouldn't be here with us tonight. So I was lucky enough to convince them to accept the results of the election. And I took Daniel Ortega around to Violeta Chamorro's house, and I supervised while they hugged and kissed each other. And then I arranged with Ms. Chamorro and with Daniel Ortega and with the Secretary of State of the United States to make the same exact speech the next morning at 6 o'clock. It was a very gracious speech, just acknowledging that the Sandinistas had lost, but they were going to cooperate with Chamorro in the future. And so when I called Secretary of State in the United States, he said, well, what do you want me to say? And I said, well, I've already written a text for the other two, and I'll give you a copy of it. So I emailed him a copy of the statement I already made. So at 6 o'clock the next morning, all the United States and the Sandinista government and the new victors all made exactly the same speech, all of which were written by me.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how it's done.
But it's hard to think of humor, you know, when you... I didn't make up any of that.
No. I have one for both President and Mrs. Carter. It's, what is one thing that surprised you about being President and First Lady?
I'll answer first because you'll get
What's
mine.
it?
So if I don't.
All right, go ahead. I'll let you go first.
Well, we got to the White House, and we had a lot of company because many of my family were there, lots of Jimmy's family was there. And we got there January the 20th, and the first of the second day of February, we got a bill for our food that we had eaten.
That's a surprise.
And it was over $600, and this was 1977. 1977. $600 was a wad back then. I couldn't believe we had to pay for our food, but we did. And we also had to pay $1 over first class every time we rode on Air Force One. And if Amy went to Camp David with us on Air Force One, it was $20.
On a helicopter.
On a helicopter. It was $20. And if she took a little friend, it was $20 for the little friend.
And
Did I leave anything for you?
yeah, well, one of the things that surprised me when I got there was that we had lived in the governor's mansion in Georgia, and we were the first ones that did a whole term there. And anyway, when they built the new governor's mansion for Georgia, I was in the state senate. I voted against it, by the way. But when I was elected governor, I was glad that I had voted for it. But anyway, the experts on styles and furniture and everything from Georgia had gone all over the nation and had picked out the finest period furniture and fixtures. So we got first crack at it. And when John Kennedy and Jackie moved into the White House, they did the same thing, but they were too late because we had got the first choice of every fine piece of furniture of that period. So my biggest surprise was moving into the White House and learning that it was not as nice as the governor's mansion of Georgia.
Well, while we're more or less talking about politics, here's an interesting one for either or both President and Mrs. Carter. Which is the better strategy for Democrats? Motivate the base or recapture the center, including disenchanted Trump voters?
Well, I don't think that's the two choices, as a matter of fact. I think the biggest question now is whether the Democrats should move to a very liberal program like universal health care and things of that kind. I won't go to the list, or to stay in the center. And both Rose and I voted for Bernie Sanders in the past, so he pretty well represents the liberal side. But I think that for the Democrats this time is to appeal to the independents. I noticed today in a published poll that I saw tonight, as a matter of fact, that only 33% of independents are still in favor of Trump, and 37% of Americans are in favor of Trump, and 57% think he's done a very poor job. So we have a good chance to get those independents, and I think that we should concentrate our efforts on that. I don't think any Democrat is going to vote against the Democratic nominee after we choose him, but I think a lot of independents need to know that they can invest their vote in the Democratic Party in 2020 if we appeal to the middle of the road people.
Can you run again?
I think there's an age limit. I'm legally qualified to run, but I am not going to run. And I say all the TV cameras are getting that latest wonderful news coming out of the Carter Center.
Well, I'm the politician in the family, but I take Jimmy's word for what he said.
President Carter, although we have compromised our position as a world leader in human rights, can we reestablish our leadership position, and can we do that in time to help the children who are being held in detention centers under the current administration?
It's hard to know that we can do it that quickly because we're going to still have the same administration, presumably, until the 2020 election. And I don't see that we can change the policy of the government to let the children go. But I think that inherently America is dedicated to basic human rights. We are the most heterogeneous population on earth. Our people, except for Native Americans, have come from every country on earth. And we are comprised of people who quite often came here, at least the ancestors did, to escape persecution and for religious freedom and to join a democracy prospectively. And we have the most innovative people on earth as well, because everybody that came over here, all of our ancestors, left a secure place at home, relatively speaking, and they came over here and took a chance on moving into a new place where they didn't know anybody. Our ancestors did. So I think we've got the kind of population in America, if appealed to correctly, to to be champions of human rights. It's not an accident that our founding fathers wrote an original Constitution that was filled with human rights elements, and also the first amendments to the Constitution guaranteed specifically freedom of speech and freedom of religion and things of that kind. So I think America is inherently committed to human rights, and I believe in the future we'll let that feeling prevail. But for the next 2 years, I can't predict that the imprisoned children are going to be any better off, unfortunately.
Another serious one. Given the present breakthrough with North Korea, is there any possibility for a rapprochement between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran in the next 3 years?
Well, I've always been in favor of normalizing relations with Iran and having direct communications with them. But after I left office, that was one of the last things that happened when I was in office, but I didn't have time to implement that policy. And I've been disappointed that Democratic and Republican presidents have not reached out to Iran in harmony. The first president that did that was Obama, and John Kerry was the primary representative who negotiated the agreement to control nuclear weapons in Iran, and I was very much in favor of that and think it was a serious mistake to abandon it. You mentioned North Korea?
Yes, the premise of the question is, given the present breakthrough in North Korea, I'm not sure there is one, but that's the premise.
I'm not sure either, but let me say this. I made a television program this afternoon, and one of the questions was about the current administration. And I said, I pray for President Trump. I pray that he will be successful in office. I pray that he'll keep the peace. I pray that he will honor human rights. And I pray that he'll be successful in his initiative to North Korea. I believe that he did wisely by meeting with Kim Jong-un in, I forgot what month it was, back in October, something like that. Anyway, September maybe. But anyway, I think he did wisely by meeting with him. And I've been to North Korea 3 times. And I believe that the North Koreans want to have peace. What they want more than anything is what Kim Jong-un is now demanding, and that is that the United States declare an end to the war in Korea, the Korean War. I was in a submarine in the Pacific Ocean during that war, and I know how much I despised the North Koreans then because we had so many people lost in North Korea, but I have understood their desire to have peace with the United States. Under George W. Bush, up until then, we at least were talking to them. President Obama refused to have any relationships with North Korea and prevented whenever he could my going over to North Korea to try to talk to them. He did let me go away and get one prisoner out of North Korea, which I was glad to do. But anyway, I think we ought to reach out to North Korea and declare an end to the Korean War and have a peace agreement with the North Koreans. And I believe that would be, you may doubt this, but I believe that would be enough in itself to bring an end to the nuclear program in North Korea. If we would recognize North Korea, have a peace agreement with them, and treat them, let them be part of a community of nations, and back off from our punishment of them, economically and otherwise, I think that would be adequate, and that's what I would like to see done.
Thank you. President and Mrs. Carter, this question is from Janice in Knoxville. How has your long, vibrant marriage enriched your life and work?
What's the question?
marriage enriched your life?
That was it. How has your long and vibrant marriage enriched your life and work?
I'll let you answer it first.
Um,
She can't
Well,
think of anything.
I don't know. I've been married all of my life almost. And I don't know how it could have been enriched more if it had not been for Jimmy Carter.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I believe the Carter Center has been successful is because we have a good relationship with each other. And every basic decision that was made in the founding of the Carter Center, and most of them on the way, we have been consulted and before the big decisions were made. And we're backing away from that now. Rosalynn just passed 91 years old. I never knew I'd, be married to somebody that old, but anyway. But anyway, so we're kind of backing away, and we're letting our grandson Jason, who's chairman of our board, and Mary Ann and others take care of it in the future. So I've cut back a lot on international travel, but we still are involved. We had a meeting with Mary Ann and others today to just talk about some of the things that I mentioned earlier today. So I think if we hadn't had a good and vibrant and active marriage, we couldn't have had, I couldn't have been president, and we couldn't have had the Carter Center.
I have just a couple more. What continues to encourage your work for justice? Where do you see signs of hope? And again, this question is for President and Mrs. Carter.
Well, the Carter Center has one overriding umbrella under which everything is cast, and that is human rights. And Rose and I both believe, and I think everybody at the Carter Center believes, that human rights apply not only to the right to worship as you choose, and the right to assembly and freedom of speech, and being able to vote for our own officials to lead us, but we believe that everybody has a right to a decent place in which to live, and to have a modicum of education, and to have a chance to be relieved of the burden of unnecessary diseases. And so the very practical things that affect the joy and pleasure of every family on earth is a broad-based thing. But I think for a summary, I'll repeat what I said earlier tonight, and that is that treating everybody equal within a country or around the world, men, women, Jews, Christians, Muslims, black and white, newcomers to a country or immigrants, they need to be treated as equal in the eyes of God. And that's the essence, that's the foundation of all human rights. And the Carter Center pursues that, and we'll continue to pursue it as long as we're alive, and I'm sure it'll go on after Rose and I are no longer here. And so that gives me hope about the future. The Carter Center by itself can't do very much, but we'll do our share.
Indeed. Mrs. Carter, how are your mental health journalism fellows making a difference in decreasing the stigma that persists around mental illness?
I think they're making a really large difference in the countries other than the United States, and I think that they've helped in the United States. It seems that I think the statistics show that 1 in every 7 people are touched by some of the things that our fellows have done. And And that's big, and some of the countries that are represented here, other countries today, the stigma is like it was when I began in 1966 working on it. Nobody mentions it in the country. They don't let people know they have a mentally ill person in the family. And those countries are being helped. The fellows are changing the way mental health is looked at in those countries, and I'm pleased about that. I think that, I know we've had things happen like in Ohio once, one of my fellows said before he was a fellow, there were 6 articles about mental health in the paper. And when he was fellow, he had 66 in the paper. And they actually had to close a children's hospital because of his articles. And we've had that happen in more than one instance when we could see vividly how the fellowships had made a difference. So I'm really proud of all of my fellows, these and the ones that came before them, because we have them all over the country now. And so many of them continue to work on mental health issues after that fellowship is over.
I think they have, I think every fellow that we've had at the Carter Center has been effective because they have, in effect, magnified the voice of my wife.
We have time for one last question, and I almost censored it. But it has some good points. It says, "Sir, thank you for your service to our country." But it also says, "Will Army or Navy win this year? Go Army." So that's not a question, but perhaps the secret Army supporter expects a reply.
Well, at the end of the season, I'll be sympathizing with you.
Yay! Go Navy.
Anything else?
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.